Welcome to our second season of Stratford Mail, a smart little history podcast from Stratford Hall Historic Preserve, where the voices of American history still speak. Find us online at stratfordmail.org and at stratfordhall.org. We're so glad you're back, and we hope you'll share Stratford Mail with a friend or colleague. Here now is our Director of Research, Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
Double toil and trouble. Fire burn and cauldron bubble.
Time once more for our seasonal special edition of Stratford Mail. The three Weird or Weird sisters from Shakespeare's Macbeth, referred to as witches in the stage directions, have fired our imaginations and cultural images of witchcraft and witches since that play was first performed in 1606. How easy to picture the three sisters stooped over that bubbling cauldron as they inventory ingredients for a hell broth. Fillet of a fenny snake, wool of a bat, gall of a goat, and the ground stomach and throat of a mummy. Folks had witches on their minds in 1606, in part because the New English King James I was consumed by that topic. In 1597, James wrote a book titled Demonology, wherein he explained that,
"My intention in this labour is only to prove two things. The one, that such devilish arts have been and are. The other, what exact trial and severe punishment they merit."
Demonology was written in the aftermath of the North Berwick witch panic of the 1590s, the first major witch hunt in Scotland. The use of the term witch hunt by American politicos who feel they've been wrongly accused reflects a misunderstanding of American and European witch lore. Witch hunts rarely targeted the powerful. They targeted vulnerable and secondary populations of early modern society, typically women. Women described as argumentative, combative, or who exhibited some form of agency not expected of women or prescribed for them, often found themselves on the business end of witch hunts. Witch beliefs and warding practices crossed the Atlantic with the English-speaking settlers of the New World. They reflected centuries of cross-pollinating European traditions about witches, witch-finding, and witch wards, found in countless pamphlets, judicial transcripts, folkways, and even in artwork and entertainments like Macbeth. A result of all these sources pooling together is that witch lore tended to look more and more uniform over time. One feature of that uniformity was diabolism, or the idea that witches are in cahoots with the devil of Christian traditions. We see this in James' Demonology with its reference to the devilish arts, but a 16th century pamphlet about 4 women and 1 man executed for witchcraft in Abington, England, expresses the point best.
"The witch bears the name, but the devil dispatches the deeds. Without him the witch can continue no mischief."
Demonic compact, or allegiance to Satan in exchange for supernatural powers, is a vibrant theme of early modern witch lore, and nowhere more evident than in the 1692 witch panic at Salem in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But Virginians weren't Puritans, even if as Protestant Christians they shared some core ideas and values. English settlement of Virginia lacked the overarching religious vision of Puritan settlements in the North. This isn't to say that the Virginia Company of London didn't pay lip service to broad Anglican Christian objectives, but those objectives routinely took a back seat to commercial interests. In his November 1622 sermon to the company, poet and preacher John Donne needs to remind the shareholders that
consideration of profit and religion may well consist together.
It was religion they'd neglected, not the profit. The point is that Virginians were much less likely than Puritans to see themselves as individual and collective combatants in some epically scaled metaphysical contest between God and the devil in the American wilds. Virginians weren't immune to the fear of witchcraft, and the first witchcraft charges on record in British North America occur in 1626 in what would become Surry County, Virginia, long before any rumors of witches in New England. Left-handed midwife Joan Wright, who by her own admission had some knowledge of witchcraft and who her neighbors found to be a caustic, disagreeable person, became the community scapegoat for a series of adverse incidents, the death of a newborn, crop and livestock failures, and the like. This was the pattern generally. Identification of a witch was a release valve for community anxiety about unlucky and adverse events, and it helped the community to reestablish some sense of control. Joan Wright was acquitted. In keeping with the 1604 witchcraft statute of James I, Virginia courts recognized two types of witchcraft.
If any person or persons shall use, practice, or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil and wicked spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil and wicked spirit, or shall use, practice, or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery, whereby any person shall be killed, destroyed, wasted, consumed, pined, or lamed, in his or her body, or any part thereof, that then every such offender, or offenders, their aiders, abettors, and counsellors, being of the said offences duly and lawfully convicted and attainted, shall suffer pains of death as a felon or felons, and shall lose the privilege and benefit of clergy and sanctuary.
In addition to felony witchcraft, the statute set a term of 1 year imprisonment for petty witchcraft, which involved the misdemeanor use of spells, charms, and incantations. Several years before Stratford was built, Parliament repealed the 1604 statute to reflect the rise of the new science and a widening spirit of enlightenment characterized by rational inquiry and thought. The 1604 statute was nevertheless the law of the land for almost 150 years, notably during the founding and the early formation of British North America. This law of the land could be supplemented so long as it wasn't countermanded or contradicted. In 1655, the justices of Lower Norfolk, Virginia, supplemented the law to better suit emerging Virginian sensibilities about witchcraft.
Whereas diverse and scandalous speeches have been raised by some persons concerning several women in this county, terming them to be witches, whereby their reputations have been much impaired and their lives brought into question, it is by this court ordered that what person soever shall hereafter raise any such scandal concerning any parties whatsoever, and shall not be able to prove the same, both upon oath and by sufficient witness, such person so offending shall in the first place pay £1,000 of tobacco, and likewise be liable to further censure of the court.
Thus, the only uniquely Virginian policy pertaining to witches wasn't about witches as such, but responded instead to the social instability caused by allegations and accusations of witchcraft. The existence of this policy suggests that Virginia courts and the elites who staffed them were far more circumspect about witchcraft allegations than the common folk. In 1659, Anne Godby of Norfolk, Virginia, was convicted under this statute for defaming Mrs. Nicholas Robinson, terming her a witch, and her husband, Mr. Godby, was ordered to pay £300 of tobacco and fines and legal costs. You see, Anne Godby had a history of litigations, and in 1648 was sentenced to receive 15 lashes for grossly defaming a Mrs. Lloyd. And only a week before the Norfolk justices passed the 1655 statute, they heard a suit brought by Mrs. Thomas Daines against Anne Godby for defamation. What we learn from this is that to Virginia courts, witchcraft allegations were pragmatically secondary to social cohesion in a hostile, forbidding environment. What you rarely see in the extant Virginia records is any talk of demonic compacts or deals with the devil. So far as we can track this in the courts, and our records are incomplete in the aftermath of the Civil War, the devil just wasn't a problem in Virginia, but the social stress caused by allegations of witchcraft and witch trials was. As a rule, Virginians were more pragmatic than doctrinaire. Virginia wasn't some grand theological experiment in the way Puritan New England was intended to be. Virginians opted for socially cohesive behavior over unity of beliefs, and that would till the field for religious toleration and freedom later. Theology can get in the way of making money in an unforgiving environment in a way that behavioral unity doesn't. I'm not saying Virginians didn't believe in the devil. I'm saying they don't seem to have an appetite to talk about it, and their investigative and legal apparatus certainly show no appetite to prosecute women and others for diabolical entanglements. Take the case of the most famous of the Virginia witches, Grace Sherwood, the so-called Witch of Pungo. Grace was in and out of the courts pursuing defamation charges and damages against folks who put it about that Grace was a witch. Her litigious and fraught relationships with her neighbors culminated in 1705 when Grace was awarded damages in an assault case filed against neighbors Luke and Elizabeth Hill. In what looks to be a retaliation, the Hills later alleged that Grace was a witch responsible for Elizabeth's miscarriage. Princess Anne County justices did everything they could to dissuade the Hills from pursuing the suit. To no avail. In March 1706, Grace was searched by a jury of women for incriminating bodily marks. They found spare teats and other unspecified marks, likely proof of a witch. Now, what did the justices do? They referred the case to the Governor's Council in Williamsburg, who ordered an investigation before promptly referring the matter back to the county for additional inquiry. By July, the justices had decided, and Grace had consented, to a trial by ducking, the infamous water test no longer in use in Europe. But the trial was postponed due to inclement weather and concern for Grace's health. On July 10th, Grace, bound hand to foot and weighted, was tossed into the Lynnhaven River. She managed to free herself from her bonds and swam to shore, all of which meant she was guilty.
Everyone knows that witches float.
Yes, because the purity of water, think baptism here, won't embrace an impure entity. Grace was convicted and sentenced to 7 odd years in prison. Now let's put that in perspective. In Salem, which admittedly was a limit case, 4-year-old Dorothy Good was imprisoned and shackled for 10 months on the mere suspicion of being a witch, because her mother Sarah Good had been convicted of witchcraft and hanged. By contrast, the Virginia court did not act precipitously on the allegation against Grace. Now again, Virginians believed in witches, and they took their own measures, including the use of protective wards like those incised on the exterior brick and interior floors of Stratford Hall, or witch jars like the one found in York County, Virginia in 2016. A practitioner would place metal pins, sometimes hair, in boiled urine, seal it in a small jar, and bury it upside down in the belief that any malevolent spell would boomerang onto the witch who cast it, who would be ID'd by and suffer from bladder discomfort. An overwhelming majority of persons formerly accused of witchcraft in Virginia were acquitted. Grace was an exception, though she was pardoned by former Virginia Governor Tim Kaine on July 10, 2006. The only known execution for witchcraft in Virginia wasn't in Virginia, but rather en route to Virginia. In 1654, Catherine Grady, an elderly Englishwoman bound for Jamestown, was executed by hanging for witchcraft after the captain of the ship on which she'd booked passage identified her as the source of a perilous storm. Now, while demonic compact isn't really a feature of the Virginia witchscape, let's consider an outlying case, which happened right here in Westmoreland County, Virginia. In 1695, Henry Duncan accused his brother John's wife, Elizabeth Duncan, of suckling the devil. The charge wasn't carried. Elizabeth and John countersued for damages totaling 40,000 pounds of tobacco and were awarded 10 pounds of tobacco. Several things to note here, and our records in this case are more complete than in any other criminal or civil witchcraft trial in Virginia. First, as I've said, this kind of accusation was rare, but you can learn something about Chesapeake witchcraft from it, namely that neighborly conflicts and feuds were often at the heart of all such allegations. Second, the court ignored the sensational charge that Elizabeth was suckling the devil and awarded just enough on the countersuit, 10 pounds of tobacco, to make a point, but without putting Henry Duncan in the poorhouse and adding fuel to the spiraling feud. Third, the Duncans came from Scotland, as had James I, and there witchcraft was tied to demonic compact. Consider also that from 1542 to 1735 there were around 1,000 executions for witchcraft in England, but in the same period in Scotland, which is 1/5 the size of England, there were around 4,000 executions. Fourth, this is 2 to 3 years after Salem, when most colonists are running away from the kinds of sensational claims involved in the tragic and embarrassing Salem witch panic. Elizabeth Duncan was accused of literally smelling of fire and brimstone. Fifth, the 3 witnesses in the Duncan trial were awarded a total of 640 pounds of tobacco, meaning that the justices placed a premium here on evidence. And sixth, only a year prior, John Duncan unsuccessfully sued his brother Henry Duncan for an outstanding debt of 3,000 pounds of tobacco. Virginians preferred what English reformer Thomas Cranmer called a
cheerful and comfortable faith.
Nothing too controversial, nothing too challenging. The Virginia wilds were difficult enough to master without the problem of social instability caused by fear of rampant supernatural powers and agents. Neither Anglican theology nor Anglican preaching inspired people to take up religious practices that were keyed to close self-scrutiny, studying oneself for marks of election or damnation, grace or sin. Generally speaking, Virginians weren't on the lookout for that in others either. The extant records pertaining to witchcraft in Virginia lack the seriousness of the New England records. New England Puritans were at war with the devil and their own lower natures in a grand theological experiment in the New World. For Virginia Anglicans, being religious was largely about shoring up order and stability in an explosive, hierarchically ordered slave society, but that is a story for another day. From Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, Virginia, I'm Director of Research, Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
Dear listener, you can do more than just listen. Become an active participant with Stratford Hall in the production of new and exciting programmes like Stratford Mail. Please donate online at stratfordhall.org/donate, and above all, share Stratford Mail with someone you know, someone you love. They'll be so happy you did,